Good morning. I'm Cory Hallam at Texas Biomed. I serve as the Vice President of Business Development, and I'm also Professor of Innovation Management. This morning's event, we're very excited to have a distinguished set of panelists discussing the role of innovation in preparing and addressing pandemics. If we think about the innovation continuum, there are many different definitions. We have beginning with the discovery science through the creativity process, all the way to invention. And that's sort of the precursor to this overall process. If we really look at innovation, it's then that translational process of these discoveries and creativity into application that generates some kind of returns. In a traditional business sense, these might be seen as ROI or financial returns. From a process perspective, it might be better production delivery or efficacy. And from a policy perspective, it can actually deal with the way we invest, the way we respond, whether we're reactive or proactive, that have outcomes associated with our public health and economic security and growth in societies. And so today we bring 5 distinguished panelists to join us here at Texas Biomed to discuss this innovation process from different perspectives. Texas Biomed itself has been involved in innovation for over 80 years, both from the discovery side through the creativity and spin-off side, licensing technologies, launching companies, and supporting companies bringing discovery science to market in generating cures and therapies for hepatitis, for Ebola, and many active programs from A to Z in the pathogen space where we have HIV, TB, Zika, COVID work. If you look at the campus, a phenomenal cadre of folks. And so we're extremely excited to host today's panel. And our first speaker I'm going to bring on is Pape Samb. Pape is Executive Director of Ashoka Africa and Vice President of Ashoka Global. He has more than 20 years of experience and an established record in strategic planning, program development, management, and social innovation. And when we talk about a career that started young, at 13, he started a women's empowerment and youth economic development organization. And at 17, he was president of Cap Jeunesse, a Senegalese network of youth organizations, and was hired by the government to train youth in entrepreneurship, business, and grassroots organization management. He moved on to become the president and CEO of Phelps Stokes, America's oldest continuous operating foundation, and he was the youngest and first non-American to lead the organization. His energy has led him to become a driving force in empowering agents of change in youth globally. He's an active public speaker. He holds a master's in executive leadership and public administration from American University. And he has won many awards on leadership and excellence and next generation of leaders. And so, Pape, I'm going to hand it off to you to give our first overview of the involvement of innovation in pandemics.
Thank you, Cory. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. So I'm really happy to be here with all these colleagues, so everyone here. And I'm excited also to hear and learn from each one of them. Thanks also for Texas Biomed for inviting me to this prestigious event. And I'm also, like I said, excited to learn more about what's happening. I think today we're talking about a topic that's really essential. And I think the time is excellent and right because of the pandemic that we all live in. And global health for me, I think I will be coming from a different perspective because I believe that global health also is a political, social, and economic issue that require a new framework for thinking and acting because we are living in a new reality and a new inequality. And those two things, I think that's something that I want to also talk about further, which is the new reality and the new equality. So I'm be looking into maybe how social innovation, because I'm representing Ashoka here, and maybe I think to talk about Ashoka a little bit. Ashoka is an international organization that has 4,000 leading social innovators who have changed systems, who have changed policies at the national level, who have replicated that model outside of their countries, and who also have really created new innovation for companies, for universities, for public-private sector. So I'll be looking today into how social innovation and change making could champion new policies, new processes, new systems that really improve well-being, health, and livelihood of underserved communities in the global south, most especially in the global south, but through what I call the collaboration and entrepreneurship with public-private sector as well as academia. I mentioned earlier that we are in a new reality. And the new reality, I think it's really clear that this is a historic moment. And I'll start by asking 3 questions. There are so many questions that we can ask, but I'll start with asking 3 questions. The first question is that for us to ask ourselves these questions, we don't necessarily have to respond it, and I might not be able even to respond it, but I just want everybody to think, why are income distribution getting worse everywhere? The second question is, why are these worsening us versus them, meaning in population, the global population? There is always the us versus them. Why the politic of us versus them is spreading across the world? And the last question is, why do so many people feel pushed to the margin? Many people feel like they're left behind. So these are really questions that I think really brings back the whole issue of global health. And as I said, this is really a new reality because we are living in a truly historic turning point as a world that has largely been defined by repetition. Everything that we've been doing in the last 300 years pretty much is defined by repetition. And right now, where we are right now, the rate of change has extended the rate of interconnection, which when you connect to both change and interconnection, it multiplies each other. So the world now has been accelerating exponentially for the past 300 years. Like everything that we've been doing right now has been accelerated. And the only thing that's constant in this world is change. Nothing else is constant. Change is the only thing that happens over and over and happens every second. So if you add globalization and technological innovation to these problems, it really creates new barriers, and it also allows everybody to participate. So this is where really we think that the demand for repetition is no longer what we need in this world. And that's why from Ashoka perspective, we're talking about change making. And that's why we also believe that there is a new framework that needs to happen, the way we think and the way we collaborate. So I mentioned that in the past, repetition really has been defining the world. If you look at, for example, bankers, if you look at bakers, you learn a skill, and that's the same skill that you repeat in the workplace with many walls, because workplace has been in 4 walls. Now, all of those things are really dying. So the new framework is a framework that's based really on empathy. How do we bring different people to collaborate to work around empathy? How do we bring the public and the private sector to work? How do we bring academia to work together? It's also based on what we call change making. Change making is challenging the status quo. Why this table is square? So everything that we have lived in the past 300 years, we have to look at it and challenge it to be able to really define and anticipate what's going to happen in the world. There is also what we call collaborative entrepreneurship. We are used to the 3 sectors: the public, the private, and the social sector. But we have social entrepreneurs who don't define themselves by any sector. We have also academia with brings research. So all of those things, I think those are the things that we need to look at right now. And the COVID pandemic really has challenged us to rethink differently and to act differently. I think I'll stay there for now. So I'm running out of time, but I'll come back later. Thank you so much, Cory.
Thank you, Pape. I actually absolutely appreciate your perspective on this and understanding that it is a multifaceted, long time span problem, and we can't look at this as a simplistic type of situation. Next, we have Hashim Mulangwa. He's the Chief Development Strategy Officer of Global Innovation Fund and is responsible for ensuring that their investments are deeply grounded in the best evidence and practice of economic development. He joined GIF after leading a team of experts for the Uganda Ministry of Finance that supported the establishment of a COVID-19 economic response unit and development of the government's fiscal stimulus package. He was also the team leader for Uganda for a large program supporting foreign direct investment in Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Rwanda, and Director of Transformation and Service Delivery for a governance and accountability program funded by several organizations, including USAID. As Chief Strategy and Development Officer of the Rwanda Development Bank, he has led the bank's transformation agenda as a DFI that supports Rwanda's development priorities. Early in his career, he spent many years as a senior policy advisor for Uganda's president's office, and he earned his MPA in economic development from Harvard University. So Hashim, thank you so much for joining our panel. And I am going to share my screen so that we can see your slides.
Thank you, Cory. And thank you for having me. And I'm really delighted to be joining this esteemed team of panelists. So I wanted to give you a sense of what it is that we do at GIF as impact investors and how we responded to the pandemic. First, a little bit about GIF. GIF is a multilateral nonprofit innovation fund, which is supported by government, philanthropies, and companies that invest in development. And we support rigorous testing and scaling of innovations targeted at improving the lives of the world's poorest people. Through our grants and risk capital investments, we help bring to the market solutions to global development challenges from the perspective of for-profit funds or businesses, non-profit organizations, researchers, and government agencies. But how did we use innovation to address problems related to the pandemic? I want to share some examples of how we did that. Next slide, Cory. I want to share some examples of how we did that. And then also share our perspective on innovation, because we think this is important actually as a background. At GIF, we define innovation as new solutions with the potential to address an important development challenge more effectively and cost effectively than existing approaches. But simply put, we really look for new ways of solving development problems and strongly believe that great ideas can come from anywhere, they can come from anyone. And we source these ideas through open competition. But like many organizations, GIF struggled with figuring out how to balance key considerations around our investment process as impact investors, the need for rigorous evidence to measure impact, an understanding of pathways on how we can actually scale up these investments, versus the need to respond to the pandemic in real time. How could we assess impact in times of uncertainty, when little was known about the disease, how it spreads, its prevalence, its fatality rate, and many unanswered questions? So as a practical matter, we made a commitment to put practicality and pragmatism at the core, at the forefront of how we do business. First, we wanted to look in our portfolio for innovations that could respond to the crisis. Many of these innovations, as I said, we already had a lot of information on in terms of what kind of impact they would have. But in terms of responding to the pandemic, we wanted to explore how these innovations would respond to the pandemic and how their implementation processes would be adapted. Secondly, we wanted to seek out innovations that would especially provide value in gathering data in the absence of a lot of information and data. We wanted to seek out innovations that would provide that kind of data, and that data could then facilitate decision-making in a timely manner. In the first category of innovations that we actually look at in our portfolio, there are some themes that actually we felt that were important for us to actually look out for. Innovations or businesses or ideas that would support active fieldwork in health systems and specifically would support behavior change would be critical in terms of responding to the pandemic. Next slide. Among these is an organization called BRAC, which is an organization, a nonprofit that actually works in the health sector in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Uganda and many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We supported BRAC initially because of its strong record of working and strengthening healthcare systems in Sierra Leone and in Uganda. But specifically in terms of responding to the pandemic, we were keen to leverage its behavior change capabilities through the work that it was doing for behavior change messaging and reinforcing its in-person support with community health workers. So that with the work that with BRAC was very important for us. The other kind of innovations that we worked with that were in our portfolio that actually addressed some of the challenges that the pandemic was bringing across was Strong Minds, which is an organization that addresses depression in women in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in Uganda and Zambia. We worked with Strong Minds to pivot its in-person therapy model to actually do a telephone therapy model that would treat more patients, about 7,000 patients, with initial results that were comparable in terms of efficacy in-person treatment. Lively Minds, another organization that we work with that does a lot of work around childhood education, early childhood education in Ghana, pivoted its business model, its delivery model, to a radio programming model that actually would reach more than 1.1 million people, which was a bigger impact that we actually anticipated in the initial impact assessment that we did. So many of these organizations that we worked on, next slide please, would actually have a bigger impact in terms of leveraging technology capabilities and using technology platforms to do business. Some of the other organizations that we supported include Health Connect and PASS. PASS would support governments in Malawi and in Malawi, Pakistan, Nepal, and Indonesia to use environmental surveillance mechanisms to address the spread of COVID by using fecal sludge and wastewater samples to detect pathogens. This project will also include the establishment of a data center to support analysis and the sharing of data methods and research with public authorities in this country. So in the end, what we really learned from this is that we could not do business as usual. We had to change the way we're thinking. We had to change our investment processes. As our partners were innovating themselves, we were innovating in terms of changing our investment processes to actually address the pandemic. But as importantly as well, we were able to leverage our portfolio to actually address these problems in ways that were actually responding in a timely manner and quicker than the way we would have done before. Thank you, Cory, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Hashim. Absolutely appreciate that perspective, and perhaps what is telling about that is the leverage of those investments. And if you look at economic disparities between countries, what one country might consider a large investment, another might consider very minimal, and to look at that leverage effect is absolutely phenomenal. So I hope as we open up to the panel to questions from the audience, we're able to come back and address some of those. Well, next I'm excited to have Jennifer Siler. She's Vice President Global Community Engagement at the Sabine Vaccine Institute. And before that, she served as Innovation Team Lead and Senior Partnership Advisor at the Global Health Bureau of USAID. And she led investments in the Ebola and Zika crises, launched a one-of-a-kind series of partnerships with Facebook, GlaxoSmithKline, and DuPont, and developed multi-donor strategy and community of practice for unmanned aerial systems in global health. She's pursued several global health fellowships in Kenya, South Africa, and India with innovations in healthcare, Operation Asha, Jacaranda Maternal Health, and currently she has a master's degree in business administration from Duke with a specialization in social entrepreneurship and global health. So Jennifer, wonderful to have you on this panel, and as full disclosure, we currently have active research going on with Sabine as we test and study one of their vaccine candidates against several pathogens, including Marburg virus and Sudanese virus. So Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cory. Really excited to be a part of this panel. As Cory mentioned, I'm the VP of Global Community Engagement at the Sabine Vaccine Institute, leading our Boost community and our COVID-19 vaccine equity project. So I won't touch on really a lot of our R&D work, but I know that the president of Sabine will be joining, I believe, the next panel to speak more on that. So you can tune into that next. So the Sabine Vaccine Institute is a leading advocate for expanding vaccine access and uptake globally, advancing vaccine research and amplifying vaccine knowledge and innovation. Today, I'm going to speak specifically about Sabine's Boost community, which is a network of immunization professionals across low and middle income countries, and how Sabine's approach to innovation has helped to really drive Boost's efficacy as a platform and intervention for immunization staff in the midst of COVID-19 vaccine rollout globally. When we hear innovation, most of us immediately envision a product. And having come from USAID, working a lot on grand challenges, that is usually what I think of. And what many of us overlook are the innovations in process and approach. And these may seem like simple aspects of our work, but they can also really help to drive greater impact and frequently allow for greater ease and adaptation and scale across countries and contexts. So in my experience, the greatest success factor in developing new innovations, both incremental and game-changing, is an understanding of the users, the context, and the need. And the only true way to gain the understanding is to engage and deeply involve those future potential users of your solutions at all stages of product development. So I'll share a pathway to development for our Boost community, which was launched in January 2020, just as COVID was really quietly reaching all of our shores. Before that, we were the International Association of Immunization Managers, IAIM, from 2013 to 2020. And in our former selves, we were really focused on only national level immunization programs, held these really great annual meetings, but weren't really adaptive in understanding of kind of the everyday needs of immunization staff, particularly those at a local level. And so this is just a quick snapshot of where we are today. The Boost community, again, is a platform focused on supporting immunization staff worldwide, mainly in LMICs. Today, we have over 1,400 members, and those are the top 5 countries we have listed, but we're actually in 130 countries right now. Next slide, please. So before our launch in 2020, the team spent a couple of months in East Africa speaking with immunization professionals at every level, from national to county to district to facility, looking to understand what the needs and gaps were in everyone's everyday work. We used a human-centered design research approach, and an overview of our process is what you're seeing right now on the screen, to ensure we were building really not just a platform that would work and be effective to meet needs today, but also allow us to be really adaptable. I think Pape said earlier, change is constant. And we are certainly seeing that, of course, today in immunization, but really understanding that the needs of our immunization staff are changing each day, and how can we be adaptable in that as well. Next slide, please. So the themes we heard from immunization staff from all this HCD, human-centered design work, after hundreds of conversations, through interviews, small group discussions, and stakeholder interviews, we shaped the Boost platform with a focus on, one, really enabling connections. So we heard a lot about isolation and how immunization staff, particularly at a subnational level, didn't have connection points with one another. So they were challenged by something, they had no one to go to. 2, that burnout and fatigue was a really big challenge and issue. So people were being overworked and honestly didn't really see a career trajectory for themselves. And then 3, that we're really dealing in very complex environments, right? And a lot of folks did not feel really empowered to say, I can advocate for something and actually go somewhere. And so next slide. With kind of all of this feedback that we received, which, I think we had like almost 10,000 data points. We use the human-centered design process to really refine in on, okay, what features do we need to prioritize in our platform? And so those were around connecting, learning, and leading. And so we built out a platform that would allow immunization professionals to connect with one another, opportunities for folks to learn from one another, and building out a lot of content around both adaptive leadership and community building, bringing in what we think is one of the most important aspects of our platform, which is adaptive leadership. And then leading, also just providing opportunities for folks to lead on our platform and outside of our platform. And so when COVID hit, we had a plan to have 50% in person and 50% virtual strategy for Boost. Of course, shifted to all virtual because of the way we set up our platform, which relies on demand for events and programs to come directly from our community. We already had the building blocks to make this shift happen. Since our onset, Boost's goal was setting up a space, and I think Pape, you also mentioned this, that was not only innovative in itself, but one that would drive innovation by our community members. We believe this goal would not only be met if we built a space that allowed for vulnerability, it also encouraged empathy. How do you do that virtually? I think was one of our biggest challenges. And with that, these kind of three core pillars came to light: the connecting, learning, and leading. When we look at the adaptive leadership work that we worked on, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, came out of Harvard Kennedy School, we really appreciated that it's not just about the courses that we've run around adaptive leadership, which we've prioritized and have had several hundred folks work through. It's also about kind of adaptive leadership in itself. It helps people gain a clear perspective in the midst of action and uncertainty, making sense of complex, often conflicting signs and data, and sifting through what is most important, what's at stake, and who will support and who will resist change. And that in itself is huge innovation. It is a culture change, a culture shift. How do we create the space for that to happen? And so we've developed several intensives around adaptive leadership and started to kind of help create space in the immunization community for those conversations to drive forward. So Boost's adaptive leadership course, actually next slide, really helped us appreciate late last spring, early summer, the conversations that were happening throughout the courses were helping us appreciate that there was a huge gap and challenge in preparation for what we saw as the COVID-19 vaccine rollout at the time, of course, still not knowing what candidates would be available. But folks were talking less about global equity and more about national level equity. Given many low and middle income countries do not have life course vaccination programs, they don't have the mechanisms in place to reach adult populations. In addition, some of those most in need will be the hardest to reach. And so really worked with the community to understand what are the gaps, what are the needs. And from that, alongside JSI and Dahlberg, we actually launched the COVID-19 Vaccine Equity Project with our Boost community and helped shape what that would look like. The priority there was driving really insights, understanding the insights and the challenges, and kind of what do we need to focus on to ensure national level equity once the vaccines reach a country. We've now launched a community of practice through our COVID vaccine equity project that really focuses on highlighting challenges, lessons learned from around the world, figuring out how to connect and support one another. And I mentioned earlier, really the opportunity when you're looking at scale, that looking at approaches and processes can really help. We can learn from one another a lot, and that can be a scalable thing across lots of different borders. I know that I'm running low on time. So in closing, we really look at innovation and immunization. It's frequently highly technical, and we believe that that's important. But creating this space for community to engage with each other and gain foundational skills like adaptive leadership and community building builds the capacity that really allows for staff to tackle challenging problems and provides a support system as they navigate those hurdles and provides that space for them to innovate. We know that it is in the process of our work that where the change occurs, and through kind of keeping immunization professionals at the center of what we're doing and the center of all of our work, sitting at the table with us, it's so important that we have them there in order to accomplish all that we want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Absolutely appreciate that perspective and the growing number of perspectives we have here. Let me go to the next talk. Our next speaker is Jordi Torrelles from Texas Biomed. And Jordi joined us approximately 3 years ago and has several hats he wears, not only as a PhD who has a long track record in researching M. tuberculosis and more aggressive strains of that are harder to treat, but he also serves as director of our biosafety level 3 facility and has been leading our COVID response internal working group, getting the collaboration across campus from the scientists who have essentially taken leave from some of their long-term research strategies over the last year to lean in heavily both on moving innovations forward out of their labs, as well as supporting probably on the order of 45 or 50 companies who've now come to our campus looking for some level of preclinical assistance from those such as the Pfizers and Regenerons, where we ran challenge studies to get them into their phase 3 clinicals, to other companies who are working on diagnostics and testing devices. And so Jordi will bring to the table a different perspective. And as Jennifer said, we often think of the product side of it, and these are very expensive pharmacological type programs. But when you look at the process side or the policy side, there are other perspectives that open our eyes to how innovation can play a role in global health. So Jordi, I'll hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cory, for this kind introduction, and thank you, organizers, to put me in this excellent meeting and symposium. So today I'm going to speak about a concept that a great woman mentioned to me, hopefully is in the audience, that is simplicity in innovation. And I want to speak about the importance, and I'm going to provide you some graphic and visual examples of the points that I'm going to discuss in this first slide. So we have innovation policies to educate the population in infectious disease and chronic diseases. I'm going to show you why this is very important. Also, I'm going to present you some examples of why we need to direct, in which settings we need to direct the innovative platforms to provide us disease prevention and case tracing. And then also, I'm going to produce some examples that we need to do to improve the innovative technology platforms for point of care testing and treatments. And finally, I'm going to present you some of the current innovative policies and technology platforms that exist currently or that are in development to tackle these issues. So next, please. So the first thing that I want to mention is the necessity of doing innovative policies to educate the population. There is, as we observe with the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a general misconception about infectious diseases and also chronic diseases. And this is related to public health. For example, in my field of tuberculosis, there was a survey asking what was tuberculosis, and it is 56% of the people thought that tuberculosis was eradicated already, when in reality, tuberculosis kills one person every 18 seconds. Also, there is a problem that this general ignorance drives stigma. And when a person feels stigmatized by the society because they have an infectious disease or chronic disease, this drives this person don't seek help and don't mention that has these clinical symptoms that drives then pandemics or epidemics because they don't seek help. And I put you some examples about the ignorance in general population. For example, yesterday I was reading in the news that in Florida they're releasing like mosquito mutants to try to eradicate Zika in Florida. And there is a lot of pushback from the people living in Florida because they think that these mosquitoes, these mutant mosquitoes, will have some adverse effects against when bite people and bite their pets. Another issue is today I learned that 100 US representatives, they don't want to get vaccinated because they don't trust the vaccine system. So again, it's telling you about the ignorance that exists currently in the globe and how we need to improve policies in this matter. Next, please. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is the platforms that we're thinking and the places where this needs to be implemented. This is just an example. This is a city that we visit through my research. This is the Escuintla Regional Infectious Disease Hospital in Guatemala in the South Pacific. And this hospital, as you see it, serves close to 180,000 people area. The temperature in this place is around 93 Fahrenheit, year around with 72% humidity. In this hospital, they don't have electricity. They only have electricity comes and goes. They don't have running water during the day. They only have water during the night. You go inside of the hospital, the first thing that you observe are bats inside of the hospital. If you see in your right, you have a sink. That sink is to collect the water because you only have water during the night. And this water is being served for the health workers to wash their hands before they do an intervention, but also this water is being used to use the toilets of the faculty, as you can see here. If you go to the national hospitals, again, you can see in the Roswell Hospital in Guatemala City that they do have very low resources, and you can see patients without mattresses because they have a big bed problem. So again, we need to think about platforms that can be implemented in these places. Next, please. And it's not only Guatemala. Okay, I have been screening, and we have this everywhere. From the top, we have in Greenland, this is a rural health center. We have also going against the clock, we have Canada, we have United States. There are hospitals that they don't have electricity, and people in hospitals, for example, in Wyoming, they need to drive 300 miles sometimes to get primary care in Salt Lake City. You can see hospitals in Honduras, or in Ecuador, Malawi, Mozambique, South Africa, the Republic of Congo. You have also in Australia, you can see that they have very nice hospitals, but they don't have doctors. So you can see how this is a global problem. Next, please. Another problem is innovation technology for point-of-care treatments. So we're in the 21st century, and we still, you can see here, we have a baby that is getting an injectable drug every single day for 2 years to treat drug-resistant microbial infections. Or there are people that need to take 30 pills a day. We need to improve these conditions. You can see here in the top left, top bottom and right left, this person is from Ukraine. And the doctor sometimes needs to make this call of what they do. I stop interruption of the treatment so the person can gain weight, or I give them, or I carry on with the treatment and they lose so much weight that they go into this consumption condition. So this is things that we don't need to have the doctors to make these calls. We have good innovative platforms that help to provide drugs to these people in an efficient manner. Next, please. And this is the thing that are currently out in the pipeline. This is point of care testing and point of care treatments. We need to think about use type of specimens that are very easy to use and we can analyze very quickly, like saliva, urine, sweat, tears, blood. And there are some platforms that are already can provide testing and can provide the results in 25 minutes, and they're very easy to use. We also need to think about portable and handheld devices that can make this testing easier. Wearable point of care testing. I mean, there are now bandages, patch, even there are tattoos that you can put in children, you can put in people that change of color when the measure of their glucose change, because they do it through the people sweating. So this also smartphones, you have in your pocket a device. There are so many gadgets now being developed that can help to do microscopy in situ, endoscopies in situ for any kind of testing. And also keep in mind that we have traditional tests that work very well, but they need to be improved. So using improving test cultures, for example, that can make microbes to grow faster, identify faster, will be another possibility. But what is more important is to keep all these platforms cheap and sustainable, because right now there are very nice platforms that can identify X, Y, and Z infectious diseases in 25 minutes, but the cost initially was $3 and suddenly came to $12, $15, $20 when they establish that it works. So we need to have policies in place and make understand the investors and the industry behind that if we want to have and help these health public problems, we need to have sustainable and cheap point of care testing. And the last slide, please. And this is just to spend a few seconds in this slide. And I want you to look at these numbers. This is the number of people that die during my talk today, these 7 minutes. 340 people die of cardiovascular diseases, 23 of malaria, 33 of TB, 99 of COVID-19, 14 of HIV, and over 14,000 people in 7 minutes die in the world of preventable respiratory infections. So we should do better, and we can do better. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Jordi. It's a very interesting perspective and also sobering perspective to understand what the impact is and what the needs truly are and how there can be disconnects between the perspective of different societies. The next speaker and our final speaker on the panelist, Antony is Deputy Head of Emerging Policy, Innovation, and Capability, a team that promotes innovation, emerging technologies, and digital development to accelerate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. Prior to this, he worked on innovation financing as a strategy advisor, helping inform the UK response to cross-cutting trends impacting international development. Antony has worked on a range of international policy priorities for the UK government across international development, foreign policy, and defense over the past 10 years. So Antony, Herrmann, happy to have you here, and we'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here on this panel with such great colleagues. So I'm going to be offering some insights from my perspective from working in an innovation team at the headquarters of a government department working on international development. And I think one of the biggest immediate challenges in a rapidly evolving crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic is coordination. When you've got the pace and the diversity of activity in the initial response to something like this, it can be very overwhelming. And it can be natural for people to kind of get tunnel vision and to focus in on what they know to really try to start delivering quickly. That's especially the case when we're ourselves feeling the impacts of whether it's maybe the health impacts or the lockdowns, when you're working in a big bureaucracy. When you scale that up to the whole aid or the whole health sector, then the risks of duplication or even conflicting activities can become significant. And the thing that's characterized the successes that I've seen from the FCDO perspective and help overcome this tunnel vision is partnering. It's been about drawing on the wealth of existing partners from a wide range of disciplines and sectors, establishing open channels of communication, building trusting relationships, and importantly, creating the platforms and the forums for cooperation. Now, I'd like to give you two examples of this. The first example is around a lot of the work we did initially at the outset of the crisis was about trying to slow the spread of the disease. Before we even start thinking about treatments and vaccines, what can we do to help slow the spread of the disease, particularly in developing countries? Now, the UK has quite a lot of expertise in behavioural insights and behavioural science. We helped to establish a behavioural insights team in our government several years ago. We've been incorporating nudges in government work for some time. So we saw an opportunity here to pull together a wide range of expertise from all around the world, lots of different organisations that bring behavioural science expertise into various forums like the COVID-19 Hygiene Hub, which is a partnership with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, like the partnership with Unilever that we had on behaviour change communications. And it was about setting up weekly meetings, sharing evidence, testing different behavioural interventions as we went, and sharing the learnings in real time, and having that exchange so that we are coordinating activities and we're also learning at the same time. And this slide here is just an example of some work that the Behavioural Insights team did and were able to test and share the learning through this forum, also funded by our partners, the Global Innovation Fund. In Indonesia, you have this tradition called Mudik, which happens around the time of Eid al-Fitr, where people will migrate back from big cities to their villages where they're from. And this was seen as a really big risk for transmission, the virus being quite established in cities, real risk that people bring it home with them to rural areas. Behavioural Insights team tested lots of different messages together with the West Javan government to see what would resonate most, what would be most impactful in influencing people's behaviour. And here you have some examples. The one on the right was the one they were testing against. Quite clear message, but less persuasive than the ones with more information. The one in the middle resonated really well with the over 40s. The one on the left actually performed best with younger audiences, and that enabled them to sort of tailor their communications really clearly to different segments of society and to influence behaviours to reduce the spread. The other example I want to give is around the challenge of how do you build a pipeline of technological innovations really quickly in a crisis like this, when you don't have an established pipeline for this particular kind of crisis. If we could have the next slide, please. The example I want to give here is a partnership called COVID Action, which the FCDO established with the Frontier Technology Hub, the Global Disability Innovation Hub, and University College London. The focus here was on trying to find local solutions and trying to understand what's already being tried by local innovators, what's effective, what can we help test and scale up. And this group partnered with AfriLabs, who actually had scouts who are able to connect with people who don't even have an online presence. These are really local grassroots innovators doing things like converting water hyacinths from Lake Victoria into ethanol to create hand sanitizer. Really interesting, innovative work that we're able to identify thanks to this scouting method and support. The example here is actually from a data work stream. It's something Sergo Ventures put together using foundational data sources to establish a COVID-19 vulnerability index. And they've been working with the Nigerian government and the UN to help understand who are the people who are most vulnerable in the country, where are they, and how can we reach them. Now, I guess if we can have the last slide, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and think about what can we learn going forwards from experiences in this pandemic so far. And the point I'd really like to make here is let's challenge ourselves to learn a lesson from this about the importance of multidisciplinary partnerships as an enabler of innovation. The diagram you've got here was developed by my colleague Heather Marquette. What it shows is the flattening the curve graph we all know so well. In a developing country context, the pressure you've got to apply to flatten that curve through curfews, lockdowns, and policy responses is actually pressing down on existing cracks in the social fabric that can really exacerbate second and third order impacts, the indirect impacts of the pandemic. Things like setting back anti-corruption work, exacerbating malnutrition, creating new vulnerabilities for cybercrime, all sorts of other complicated interacting problems. And so the thought I want to leave you with is how can we use multidisciplinary, diverse partnerships like this to think about the next crisis, to think about the crises that will be happening at the nexus of health and climate change, to think not only through the health dynamics in a narrow health forum, but bring in people with those perspectives of what the second and third order impacts might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Antony. And I'm going to stop sharing slides at this point in time. And I appreciate these 5 amazing perspectives. And I'll be tracking the online questions that are coming in as we go through this. And I'm going to start with one right now, Pape, for you that's come in. And we'd like to sort of get your perspective in the next 15 to 20 years. Right? What is the framework you see requiring or changing from a scientific perspective to have us prepared or thinking ahead for feet on the ground response to emerging pandemics?
Thank you, Cory. Now, I think there are a few things that we can do first before we get to the framework, and I'll get to the framework last. I think the first thing is that the complexity of the challenge that humanity is facing right now during this COVID require that we fundamentally redesign our social and economic systems to align with ecological and cultural reality that advance to equity, because equity again is for something that I come back. To do this, we need new capability for leading across organizations. I think Antony was saying it, organizational, sectoral, and political and geographic boundaries is something that we need to look at, especially in the time that in the context of expanding volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So which also comes back to what I was saying, and then I think Jen was saying it, which is change. Change is the only constant that we really have to deal with. And if the rate of problem creation is slower than the rate of solution creation, how do we reverse the situation? If we create more problems that we solve, then we need to develop a systemic program or systemic program across sector and across countries that really guarantee that every human being becomes or discover their power as change maker. If we just rely on few people to become social entrepreneurs, to become scientists, to become maybe doctors, and then the majority of the population don't know how to solve those problems, we'll never be able to catch up with the rate of solution creation. The rate of problem creation will always be faster than the rate of solution creation. And the second thing that I would say is also we need to really figure out how do we develop an intersection between science and social innovation. We have in our program what we call the sci entrepreneurs, like social entrepreneurs who are really working with scientists in academia, in centers, for example, in biotech, to see what we're developing as solution at the local level, based on local context. How do we get backing and support from data, from scientific data, to really come up with a product or a process that helps? And those social entrepreneurs as well, I think they're really the one with the scientists. If they find that nexus, from especially with in partnership with local actors, to develop new trend and new pattern, this will bring us to this last thing, which is the framework. The framework really needs to be based on empathy. And empathy means no judgment at all. You know, empathy is empathy, no judgment. We work with everybody. Antony was mentioning partnership. It's based also on teamwork. So teamwork for me means team of team. How we bring teams of scientists, team of entrepreneurs, team of philanthropists, team of funders to come together. This is a perfect example. For example, this panel, we have different background and working with Texas Biomed, trying to explore something around there will really create something. The third one is what I call collaborative leadership. We are no longer based on a top-down leadership. Everybody must learn. The CEO, everybody must learn from the security guard. We all have to be collaborative because everybody has. And the last thing is the change making, which is we need to make sure organization, institution empower everybody to find their agency, their courage, their power to challenge the status quo. If we don't challenge what we already have, we're going to be living like the way we've been living for 300 years, and pandemic like this will always surprise us. And this will really lead us to a collective impact partnership for us to anticipate. With trend, with new pattern, with connecting science and social entrepreneurship, with collaboration, I think this really would help us anticipate what's happening, and that will bring the new identify the new trend, the new pattern, so we can anticipate what's happening, and also empower everybody to solve a problem before the problem becomes a huge one that a minority of us will have to face it to protect a majority of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pape. Absolutely appreciate that response. There's a lot to think about there, a lot to unravel in terms of the depth and complexity of that, which actually leads me to another question, and this one's for Hashim, because if you look at the impact investor perspective, right, which is essentially a different perspective than the pure profit-seeking investor perspective, and how that intertwines with changing social dynamics, changing perspectives of different generations, we'd like to get your perspective on what have you learned as an impact investor in your role, and what is needed over this next 15 to 20 year time frame that reinforces this kind of activity globally?
Thank you, Cory. I think the first lesson that we're learning as impact investors, and from the perspective of GIF and maybe other impact investors, is that it's important first and foremost to pay attention to the people that actually are living in the environment that you're actually trying to bring change. People, innovators, as Pape was saying, innovators or social entrepreneurs in these environments actually understand these problems more than anybody else, any outsider. and actually have the humility as an investor to actually come in looking at yourself as an outsider, trying to learn from people who are actually living with these problems on a day-to-day basis. So I think that is really important, because I think often the challenge is that because we have a good understanding of what it is that we're seeking out as impact investors in terms of defining impact in different ways. We have different ways that we define impact. People reach. Someone says, how many people have been impacted by this? Our own impact assessment model looks at how standards of living have actually been changed. But when you go into these communities, when you actually have people who are dealing with this problem, organizations that are dealing with this problem, they have a different perspective in some way of how they can measure success. So building the kind of partnerships that allows these people to have agency, as people were saying, as other people were saying, to allow the time for them to actually manage change without creating the kind of fissures that Antony was talking about, that really would basically unwind every positive thing that has happened, is actually really, really important. So that humility, you have the tools, all the kinds of models and tools that actually you think are actually going to help, but get into these environments with an attitude that actually says innovators in these environments are actually understand these problems better. That's one. The other one, I think, if you think long term, if you think 10, 15 years, is build the capacity of government systems in these environments to actually address these problems. It's very easy for us to say, well, environmental sustainability systems, surveillance systems could actually help with managing COVID. But if you go to Malawi, what kind of institutions actually have the capability to actually use these methods? One of the things that we were actually talking about when we were supporting this this investment in providing support for PAC to do investments in Malawi and in Zimbabwe was, what are the local institutions that they're actually going to work with to build those capabilities over the long term? It is these countries, it is these systems, local public health systems, it is the research institutions that are actually going to help you respond adequately and in a timely manner to address these kinds of things. So I think that's one thing that is really important. Don't build data systems, don't build data centers elsewhere, and not in these environments in some way. It's fine to have a data center somewhere at a university in the Western world. It's fine to have one, in many, of these cities and capitals in the Western world, but it's important to do the same in Lilongwe, in Kampala, in universities in these places. Have the patience to actually work with local partners to build that capability. So I think those, in my view, are really sort of like some of the core elements that would help inform our thinking around impact investing. But generally, even as investors that make investments as international organizations or social entrepreneurs that actually make investments that will bring really, really impactful change.
Thank you for that, Hashim. You raised several great points, especially from the distributed nature of this, as well as this ability, if you even think about it from your role and other roles here, to some extent, you could argue that governments have been impact investors for decades in these, but may be missing some of that return or outcome measure that fits within the impact investment motto, as opposed to the programmatic or flow down. And that actually flows to a great question for Jen, because you mentioned it earlier in your discussion. But essentially, the touch point for all of these programs, all these activities, are the face-to-face, shoes and feet on the ground, directly involved with either the science or the emergence of the pandemics or the prevention of them. And so from your experience and going forward, what works and doesn't work in sort of a frontline engagement, and what do we need to be thinking of in creating a broader perspective internationally for this kind of engagement?
Thanks, Cory. And also, Hashim, I wanted to add a note to what you just said too. It's like this, Boost is really focused on, and in my past life at USAID, focusing on this like foundational capacity building, this level of around strategy and leadership and enabling and empowering folks on the ground to actually be able to drive some of these innovations themselves. They have the perspective, they have all they need at their fingertips, but just being able to provide some of that capacity, I think, is absolutely essential. So couldn't not say that. So I think, for the Boost platform, we have kind of a regular cadence of connection points with members to ensure that we're meeting the mark. And for us, we have the platform and the tools to make this relatively easy. That was by design. When I was at USAID and I oversaw our Fighting Ebola Grand Challenge and our Combating Zika and Future Threats Grand Challenges, bringing essentially what made the difference was bringing folks on the ground, bringing those solutions from a very early stage in front of stakeholders. A really great example, won't name names, but where we had designed a specific intervention that folks at a procurement level were very excited about, brought some of those prototypes on the ground and heard across the board in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea from healthcare workers, no, this is not what I want. This doesn't work. It was around personal protective equipment. And so, getting those perspectives, not 6 months down the line, but from day one is so important. And so I think we're in a challenging spot now because we're in the middle of course, a global pandemic, and it's hard to kind of travel and figure out, how do you interface with folks when you're further away. We are seeing that partnerships and engagements with very local level partners, institutions are essential. You need to understand what's going on there. So if you are not there yourself, you need to find an institution to partner with, or an organization, a group, a set of individuals to make sure that you are grounding this well. We have seen more of an openness than I would expect if COVID hadn't hit to kind of virtual engagements and kind of sharing feedback, and before mentioned kind of this space of vulnerability. And Pape really liked what you said, like empathy is a necessity, right? You just bring that in. How do we find that space? And so how do you also help to create that kind of safe space so that folks can share feedback in a virtual setting? I think it's happening more now than it ever has before, but you still need those partners on the ground if you are in fact not there yourself. We have done a lot of advocating for, we have these big conversations with WHO, with Gavi, with UNICEF, and we have to have in almost every conversation, an immunization staff member at a subnational level or national level is sitting next to us or sitting, instead of us. So bringing them to the table for these discussions, having global leaders understand that like they should have a consistent seat at the table. It shouldn't just be me, from DC translating a bunch of feedback from members. So I think really figuring out a way to include those voices and have folks at the table with all of those conversations is essential. I'll also say in some cases, I'll offer up, we've worked with partners on several occasions through Boost to test out some small innovations because we have a network of 1,400 members who are really primed and open to innovation and looking at different approaches and processes. So if appropriate, also, an avenue around immunization could be engaging with a platform like the Boost community.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that. I'm also watching the time. I'm cognizant. I've got two more questions here that have popped up, one for Jordi and one for Antony. And Jordi, given this environment and given the fact that, global climate is changing, the population is increasing, the presence of zoonotic pathogens and their closeness to human populations, that is increasing. And the fact that we have this ease of transport physically of any pathogen in the world within 12 hours, essentially on a flight, what gaps are we up against looking ahead to the future? And not so much as if another pandemic's going to happen. If we look at all the coronavirus, SARS-1, SARS-2 mirrors in the last 20 years, is when they're going to happen. So where do we have gaps and sort of what's on the near-term horizon for our thinking?
So okay. So the gaps that I'm thinking is mainly a time to detection. It's very important to detect when an outbreak happens, so it does not expand to become a pandemic. And for that, we need very good surveillance programs, but also we need a lot of very good tracing contacts programs. Also, we need to have, as COVID-19 show us, we need to have effective quarantine and isolation procedures in place, because when in March, April 2020, I was speaking with my colleagues in Europe, Italy, Spain, France, and everybody was just laughing, thinking, "Oh, in China, it's very far away. This is not going to reach to us," and etc. So, and it happened, and it will happen again. So I think that there is also a lack of preparedness outside of the health system. Again, the health system are marvelous, very hard and very well established, but also we need to include global coordination and responses and mobilization of the general public. I think that, as I mentioned before, ignorance causes stigma, and stigma causes problems, and we should avoid that.
Great, thank you, Jordi. And Antony, I'm going to come back then to you to sort of wrap this up. If you think of governments and bureaucracy, you don't usually think of the word agile, right? And essentially what you were proposing was an agile response that's multinational and multifaceted in terms of skill sets. And so do you think that's possible? And what do we need to see in place in terms of coordination, collaboration that can let that kind of response happen the way you've talked about?
Thanks, Cory. It's a great question. I do think it's possible. I think it's a continual process. I wouldn't want to come across like I'm saying that we've nailed it in my organization. I think investing in innovation is a continual process, and it's about trying to help your organization remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. I talked a lot about partnership. I think the other things I would highlight are, the point Jen was making about don't just think about innovations as gadgets and technologies and things that we can invest in and develop. Think about innovation more broadly. And I think that the example about behavioral science is a great one, because the thing that ultimately spreads this virus is human behavior. And there are all sorts of entry points for innovation around that. I'd also say, I think there's a wider piece around having the right mindset, the right organizational culture, and the right kinds of skills. So, having a small interdisciplinary agile innovation team helps. This can be a starting point, a springboard for forging these partnerships quickly. It can help you bring in the right external challenge, the right viewpoints. But culturally, it's about creating an environment where it's safe to challenge. It's about all of these things. And I think it's not just about looking inwards as well at our own governments, our own organizations, and what we can do. It's about helping others to do that as well. And so the example from Indonesia was actually, it came out of a piece of work that we've been funding together with the Global Innovation Fund and a bunch of other donors to build capacity in the Indonesian government to run behavioral science trials. And it's through that we're able to so quickly do these really interesting experiments. So I guess that's brought me full circle back to partnerships again. And I suppose a nice note, if we're drawing it to a close, is just the great partnership that this symposium is helping to facilitate, and the great diversity on this panel and in all of the other panels. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists, Pape, Hashim, Jennifer, Jordi, Antony. In the 80-year history of Texas Biomed, we've had a lot of interaction on the scientific side, on the industry side, on the policy side. But I think you've highlighted 5 very unique and very important perspectives from the innovation front. And if we look at where technology has changed in 80 years, at least of our institute, the fact that the telephony infrastructure, if you looked at sort of the stages of development of communications, going from point to point hardwired to global cellular based and wireless based, where in some countries they sort of skip that hardwired infrastructure straight to mobile banking. We now carry computing power in our pockets that lets us communicate, have more information, and do more math than the moonlander could do in the 1960s. And so we have these assets available to us that allow that communication, allow that early detection. And I think on a positive side, it gives us this opportunity to think systemically. If we have faster communications, faster diagnosis, faster management from a policy perspective of how we respond and how folks are working together. And the only downside to that, we also have faster miscommunication. And I think one of the areas we haven't touched on too much, it's been hinted at, however, is the belief in science and the belief in what is being done to prevent or respond to, as opposed to what has been politicized. So I'll leave it with that there are still many challenges, but I would hope that given the state of science, what's been done in the current pandemic and what's going forward, that we're in a position to see those collaborations happen, to see the underlying science support it, to see the investment community understand the impact position, and from a policy perspective, really rethink the ways we establish those relationships going forward. So all of you, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And we hope you have a chance to stop in on some of the other sessions during this Global Health Symposium. Thank you very much.